welcome to the Fix and Prep podcast, where we dive deep into the production design details of your favorite television shows and films. With us today is production designer James Philpott. Hi, James. James Philpott is an award-winning production designer with over 30 years of professional experience. He is noted for his exceptional work on TV series such as Smallville, The 100, Debris, and Sight Unseen. James also served as a production designer on the award-winning independent feature Bones of Crows, which earned him a Leo Award and his first ever Directors Guild of Canada production design nomination. Most recently, he designed Hulu's newest murder mystery, Death and Other Details, starring Mandy Patinkin, which we'll discuss here today. James, can you tell me a little bit about how you got involved on the show?
So I had worked with a group of producers on a pilot just prior to the pandemic. Then I got this sort of mysterious email from one of the producers, Mark Martin, who works with Mark Webb, who is a very popular director, and said, James, what are you up to? Do you have something next? And I said, well, actually, I just finished something and I am looking for something new. So that was around Christmas time, and he sent me the script. It turned out one of the showrunners had been one of our writers on The 100, Heidi Cole McAdams. So we ended up setting up an interview, and it was Mark and Heidi, and then Mike Weiss, who was the other showrunner. It was such an easy and really pleasant interview. But the other thing that was really interesting about the project, and this is sort of for production designer, really juicy, the idea that the whole show was set on an Art Deco ocean liner. It's pretty exciting. So I didn't really have too many hesitations between the lovely people and the sort of fairly juicy design project. It seemed like a no-brainer to a certain degree.
There was a pilot already, and then it was greenlit for a full series. Is that correct?
Yeah, there was a pilot. It was done in Los Angeles. Then it was greenlit for a 10-episode series. I would do the 9 of the episodes. But there was a lot of retooling of the show. There were some actors who were not available for the show. There was a different ending, a different way that Hulu wanted the direction of the show. There was things that Heidi and Mike wanted changed. So I basically ended up redesigning a third of the pilot as well.
It was partly shot on a ship there. Did they mostly shoot that on location? Like, how did the interplay of what you had to match for the pilot go?
What they had done in Los Angeles is they did do a few stage sets, but they had shot a big chunk of it on the Queen Mary, which is like a historic Art Deco ship that is moored in Long Beach, California. Basically, when it came up to Vancouver, there were some sets that they had shot that they wanted to completely reshoot. So I completely redesigned. There were a couple of small sets, Imogen's bedroom and a piece of a hallway, which needed to stay because I was intercutting into existing footage. But essentially, everything else was up for grabs for me to redesign. And in fact, I got a notice from the legal department that the contract with the Queen Mary in Long Beach only worked if it was shot in Long Beach, California. So essentially, legally, I could not match to that ship, giving me a lot more freedom, which was great because by that point, I had done some significant amount of research of all the other ships of that time period. And there was a myriad of beautiful ships that were very inspiring. So I ended up basically redesigning the pool deck. The whole dining room and bar sequence was designed by me. I redesigned Anna's suite, and Sunil's office was completely original to my design. And then as we moved forward, any additional sets and things that came up in scripts were obviously something that I did the work on in my departments. So it ended up being work on our end to create the look and the aesthetic of the show. And it was fun. It was fun to be able to do that.
Well, and the dining room is just incredible. It's a huge set. So
Yes.
yeah, in the deck.
Yes, it was. I mean, there was a lot of work that went into it.
Well, even just so much woodworking.
We spent a lot of time looking at woodwork and like period woodwork and ideas of marquetry. I have to say, I probably tortured my head painter, Billy Joe Thompson, with like endless amounts of samples of woodwork and shades of stain and polish and all sorts of different things. So woodwork was a really, especially at the beginning, was a really big thing to figure out.
Walk me through the early stages of the project. You've got this ship to design and you're not allowed to fully copy the other ship, like you were saying. In terms of research, where did you draw your inspiration from?
I started by doing quite a bit of research on the period ships. And one of the things for me personally is, even though I've done a wide variety of different types of genres and a lot of sci-fi, my personal interest is in history, not only the history, but the aesthetic of the histories. And so it was actually a real pleasure for me to dig deep into the research. And one of the first areas was into the ships. And I started learning so much about all these different individual ships that were from that time period, which is where I kind of ranged from the sort of mid 20s to the late 30s. And there were so many different shipping lines. And of course, that's how people traveled between Europe and North America. And there was almost this competition at the time between the different shipping companies where every shipping line would design what they advertised as the most beautiful ship ever to be seen. And some of the ships went to such extreme levels to create the luxurious look that they would bring in all the sort of top artists and interior decorators of the time to basically design sections, bring art into the ships. And so I started looking at a lot of the ships there. And one of the ships that I really enjoyed was called the Normandy, which was a French ship that at its moment was the most beautiful ship ever. And I mean, it just some of the stuff was so spectacular. And of course, I did keep my eye on the Queen Mary because that was the pilot ship, but I couldn't go too close to that. But it was the Normandy I really loved. There was the Ile de France was a ship I also enjoyed a lot. There was another ship called the Atlantique, which I believe crossed from Europe to South America. So there was all sorts of different shipping elements. And then there's so much documentation about the different suites because each of these suites were works of art and they would be advertised for the very high-end clients so they could see what kind of accommodations they would have on the ships, which we also have to keep in mind. Some of these voyages were up to 2 weeks long, so you would want to make sure that you were having a nice place to stay while you were spending 2 weeks. And then I would look at design elements in the ships, and then I also started broadening out to the period in general. The Art Deco period was a really interesting time because it was developed in a very tumultuous period of history where the ideas of 19th century European world traditionalism was starting to fall apart. There was a lot of sort of new ideas of Bauhaus and modernism. There was interest ideas of cubism. All sorts of very interesting artistic genres were going on. And what I started finding by looking at the interior design of the ships is you would have elements where you might have some very traditional woodwork, but it was very streamlined. But then you would have these very geometric patterns on the floors and very exuberant carpets. Then you would decorate with murals that would be cubist. And it just was a very interesting mix. And that was something I really wanted to bring into our ship is all the design tensions from the time period that really made it special. And then I also started really getting into furniture too, because obviously that was a big component of the show. It's interesting because a lot of contemporary furniture that we're very familiar with, actually a lot of the design genesis was the Art Deco period. So we were able to find a lot of furniture that was either period or very similar in period. But there were some pieces that I actually designed from scratch, referencing period furniture. Like Sunil's desk was a piece that was built. A lot of the beds and various vanities that were built in were designed by me, but based on a lot of the furniture research I had done from the period.
I was thinking about sourcing. Was that hard to get in Vancouver?
The answer is yes. We had to build a number of pieces of furniture. A lot of furniture we had to bring in. Anything that was antique or real, we had to bring in. We did have to infill a lot of elements, especially when there was multiples of things with pieces of furniture that were presently made, but obviously historically inspired. Vancouver is not a particularly strong art deco city. There had been in the past a lot of art deco, but everything has been renovated and changed since then. And I mean, it was interesting because in my research, there is a hotel, the Hotel Vancouver, which is a Fairmont hotel, originally started its life as an Art Deco hotel. And I found research images of some of the lobbies and the public rooms that were so Art Deco. And I was like, oh my gosh, if this still existed, we could just shoot this, a lot of it on location. So that was interesting. And that was also an interesting discovery, even just in the city I live in, that's sort of a little bit of a side interest there.
Did you look at anything like luxury yachts for certain inspiration in rooms or like the gold or any of this little detail?
We did actually, for instance, the pool deck. There was a bit of a conversation about the idea of being a luxury ship versus a restored ship because the ideas of luxury have shifted from the 1930s and 40s to what the expectation of luxury is now. So I did really have to start thinking about, okay, it's one thing to say this is a recreation, and also in the script, like nothing was newer than 1955, but what actually represents luxury today? And to make sure that when the sets and you see them, you can imagine this would be considered luxuries now. So it did involve looking at luxury ships present day. And our pool deck was semi inspired by traditional deco ideas, but we also did look at some of the yachts. There's this Ritz Carlton yacht that is in the Mediterranean. We looked at that idea and what that would look like so that we can also maintain a present day concept of luxury where as well as maintaining the sort of the deco aesthetic that our character Sunil was aiming for. I do think Art Deco is a standard idea of luxury even today. It really ages very well in terms of coming across as very luxurious and glamorous.
Yeah. Art Deco is this like timeless luxury that we think of Great Gatsby-ish, see now. We were talking about the woodworking and all that. There's so much inlay and like art within the woodworking too. Can you tell me a little bit about the inlay artistry that was there? It felt almost like they're Easter eggs a little bit.
We had to spend a lot of time figuring out how we were going to do some of these elements. Even though we had a fairly healthy budget, one thing you learn in our business is you never have enough money. So we had to be very clever in how we did that. And we did a mixture of actual wood, stained wood, polished wood, veneered wood. But then we would also overlay printed vinyl panels that we would design some of the marquetry into, and then we embed it into the varnish. All the woodwork was designed very carefully. We did also have a development of a number of murals that were kind of into the walls. So that one, I guess, could be architecturally intentional. And so, for instance, the wall with the bamboo, which was where the first victim was found, became an iconic element there because, of course, the image of our character's spirit on the wall is very strong in the show. But we also had some more subtle things where when we end up finding our villain, there was a mural that we developed and showed very early on of a bunch of women dancing naked in Greece, which was also a very big theme in the Art Deco times. And so there was a lot of embedding art in the sets. Definitely.
So can you tell me a little bit about that main piece of artwork that is scripted at the bar in the dining room?
In the Queen Mary and the pilot, there was an actual piece of art in there, which was the one that was the scripted element in the first episode. But we decided to suggest there were subsequent bars and dining rooms in the ship. And we designed our own version of this piece of art. But the original piece of art was two unicorns fighting with each other. And one of the things that we also wanted to do was there was a celestial theme that the showrunners were really interested in of stars. And we basically redesigned a piece that was based on the celestial skies and stars. And we brought some moons and we had fish in there. And that was a completely original design. But it was quite a project because we built it using die cut layers of Sintra layered on top, and then we'd have our painters basically trowel and sculpt it, and then we did metallic bronzed finish on it. The other thing in the dining room was we also had some murals on all the walls in the dining room, and all those were done on a celestial theme. And what I really wanted to do was look at the elements, and then I integrated zodiacs, and even though it's very abstracted, because we were playing with the sort of cubist and abstracted ideas of the 1930s and 40s. Each one of those corners represents a different sort of element of nature, but also linked with the zodiac signs. So those murals were basically the fire and the water and earth and wind. So I would group, I think it's 3 different zodiac signs per natural element. So we would group the 3 zodiac signs with the actual element like fire. And then we created this abstracted image, and that's how we got to the point where we could make these murals.
So I'll go a little bit logistical now. I was curious about the timing. So how much time did you have to build the initial sets?
We had 16 weeks. I had a few extra weeks on top of that to think about things and design things, but we basically had 16 weeks to essentially draw, build, paint, and dress all those sets. It sounds like a lot of time, but if you think about all the things we had to do, it was definitely a rush against the clock. And we had a fairly significant art department because what I would often do is I would set teams together so that we'd have a team working on the pool deck and a team working on the dining room and team working on suites and things. So I had probably 4 or 5 set designers working simultaneous as teams, and then we would have various people coming in to do different artwork and whatnot. And then when we would go into the construction phase, because of the scope of the project, there were many weeks where we had almost 250 carpenters and painters working simultaneous on the stages, doing all these different things. And I think we had 8 foremen in charge of different sets, like each foreman would be in charge of this set and that set. And we had our wonderful construction coordinator, Zabish Scheller, and his foreman, Jeff McTavish, coordinated all these different people and all the 250 different people. And then, of course, I would have to make sure that everybody had things to do. And so all the design work was moving forward, which is always a big juggle because if you have 5 to 6 teams of set designers and you have 250 carpenters and you have 8 foremen and there's only one of me, it's a balance to figure out how to make sure that nobody's being slowed down because 16 weeks isn't really a lot of time to build everything that we were asked to do. And also sometimes it's just going to quiet places and just figuring things out and then coming back and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. It was a pretty intense time period, but because I had a very strong vision of what the ship was after my initial research, it helped me make decisions quickly.
Did you guys do that second unit or some other shooting in Malta?
There was a second unit in Malta. It was in episode 5, and there was a number of sequences. The whole genesis and the whole intention of that was to embrace Malta for what it was. So there was such beautiful architecture there, and there was a scripted Caravaggio in the church, which was great that we were able to actually film it and get it cleared through all the Disney lawyers and everything. I think it really added a great element to the show, and it just opened up the show right in the middle of the run.
Was that beginning section when they're entering the ship? Where was that when they're first getting on? Where was that?
That dock, the promenade where they're all coming into the ship, was in a community just south of Vancouver called White Rock. Basically, the dock was real. The ship was CGI, and then they did plate shots in Malta and then superimposed Malta over when you could see towards the town. So that had a lot of CGI in it, but I thought it worked out really well. It's always hilarious to see when you know what's real and what's not real and all the pieces that we put together. And then suddenly you see it and you're like, oh, wow, that looked kind of convincing.
Did you know really early on how the ship could be shot to look natural, that it would be blue screen?
We discussed the whole thing about blue screen. It was blue screen because it was ocean rather than green screen. There was an initial bit of a discussion of volume, but I mean, volume was just starting to become more popular. And there are a lot of volume stages that have recently been opened in Vancouver. But I think one of the things that became apparent is volume has a very different context, and it's not something that you can just pop in halfway through a prep. I think the DOPs and the directors were much more comfortable with going to a traditional blue screen concept. So we knew fairly early on it was going to be the blue screen for anything that was outside. And obviously there was like our pool deck and our main promenade decks were exteriors of the ship. We also had some interesting situations because we did run out of space. So we had to put our pool deck outside. And then we had our promenade was inside. So for the DOPs and whatnot, I mean, matching lighting and real light versus fake light was something that they had to work around as well. We worked really closely with the visual effects house, the design of the ship. So essentially the ship we designed in the art department with our pieces, our initial concepts, and then we would work with the visual effects house where they were sent initial profiles and initial floor plans and ideas of what the ship would be. And then we would have all our stage sets LiDAR scanned and then subbed into the computer model of the ship. And then we would keep going through it. I would then redesign sections that they would do a section. And I'm like, okay, well, that doesn't quite work with what our ship is. So I would work with our set design. So it's quite back and forth. It's like, okay, we don't really like these windows. These windows, can you do these? So we do a computer model and send it to them and they put them in. And then it would be like, oh, with the hand railings, like they should be like this. And so it was that whole thing to eventually we had a ship that completely was what we wanted and matched our sets.
Yeah, I was curious when I was watching that. Was the exterior of the ship design and then, but yeah, it sounds like, yeah, you did.
I also think that is something that looking into the future, we did mention briefly volume stages, is that recognition that the art department still designs and leads the aesthetic of the show, regardless if it's a physically built element or it goes into a visual effects or goes into a volume. It's really the initial ideas come from the designer and the art department. And our finger is in every pot in some ways.
What was your back and forth like with the showrunners? Did they have a good sense of what it also wanted to be, like where they were super collaborative?
They were very open and collaborative to my ideas. But Mike Weiss has very good design aesthetic. Not that Heidi doesn't either, but Mike was probably more vocal about some of the things he likes and doesn't like. And I think a lot of our ideas really aligned because, as an example, Mike was more into what he referred to as French Art Deco, which is a little bit of a more European vibe. And it's a little bit more streamlined. It's not as opulent necessarily as the early Art Deco, which came out after the First War. I would do illustrations of directions of the different sets. And the other thing that we would do is I would work with my decorator, Alex Royak, and we would do boards for all the dressing for each set. And then we would work and have conversations with the showrunners to make sure that the directions and the colors were all working in sync. We also made discoveries along the way. For instance, I discovered that Heidi's favorite color is green and my favorite color is green, as you can see behind me. You might have noticed quite a bit of green velvet in the ship, which I think is a great counterpoint to the wood, but it's also because both Heidi and I have quite a fondness for green. So that was also how that happened.
What was your like with the DP?
That's interesting. You were just talking about wood walls and things. So I did have a lot of conversations with the DPs, particularly Magni, who was our first DP for our initial prep. We did discuss things like colors of walls and colors of white and how lighting would work. I tend to like a darker wall. One of the things I really like is the idea of chiaroscuro from Italian art, where the idea of people emerging from the darkness. And one of the things he said right away is he always likes to take the skin tone of the actor and go 3 shades darker than the actor. And I mean, one of the reasons we went quite dark, let's say, for instance, Sunil's office, because Sunil is Indian, he has quite dark skin. So I ended up going quite dark in that set. A bit controversial because I think initially our showrunners a bit resistant for the show being that dark, but it really worked in the end. I think it was also the idea of working with the DOP and how to bring our actors forward and also to create this sort of lushness of the cinematography, because we did talk a little bit of how he was planning to film it, his visual references that he was looking for, because we tried to work with a lot of lush color. And as much as Heidi loved green, I know he was also looking for something. One of his references was Amelie, which is a very lush and beautifully colored film, very luminous. And so we were trying to all make sure we had enough lushness in the sets, but particularly set dressing that would give that really beautiful kind of luminous quality. And the show is very colorful, but one of the things that we also were very cognizant of is that when you do a colorful show, you also want to ground it with the woods and that, so that the show never goes into the realm of cartoon. And I think we did that.
Can you tell me a little bit about Rufus's office? Because you can really tell a lot about Rufus from those scenes that are separate from the ship with his office and then his space.
One of the things that we started looking at in Rufus's office when I started designing it was the idea of the heyday of the detective. And again, it did harken back a little bit to the Art Deco period, but it was more of the 1930s and 40s film noir movies. I actually felt that we would do an interior that really had a vibe of the 1930s detective office. And one of the things that I noticed was this idea of this big window, which a lot of them were these arch-topped windows. And I thought, let's do that. And then we had some sort of partitions that were very reminiscent of 1930s and 40s offices. And I just wanted to bring in a lot of color and texture that was also of that period, with the wallpapers, some of the flooring, recognizing that we were talking about a contemporary time periods, or in this case, it was flashbacks, but we're talking about flashbacks that were between 15 and 20 years past. So we're still talking about something that's relatively recent, So we also played with the different dressing styles of the furniture. We would start looking at furniture styles that would be more in the 1990s and mixing it with this room that had this sort of classic gumshoe vibe to it. Then we also had transformations of his fortunes, if you will. So we had the time where he was doing really well and the room was very tidy and it was set up very beautifully. And then Rufus kind of went on the skids and we really took the place down, and there would be like days old pizzas and coffee cups. And of course, his alcohol issue, we would then transfer the dressing so that it reflected his state in the world and hitting rock bottom versus when he was the greatest detective in the world.
I'm just going to go through some of the spaces that are away from the ship. The Chinese apartment. How did you think about that set?
Sealy Chung's backstory was a very tumultuous time in China. It was the Cultural Revolution, and there was a lot of very specific things that were happening in China at the time. We did a lot of research on traditional Chinese homes and apartments, and also started looking at how they would change during the Cultural Revolution, where it was stripping away what was considered like extravagant or bourgeois ideas and then reflecting it in the apartment. She was a seamstress, so it was more of a lower class type of apartment. So we went very traditional, falling out of fashion. So it would be more the poor people who would live in these apartments. But also, one of the subtle things is the picture of Mao Zedong we had, where I map it out based on its history of the time period where he was in favor and everyone had to have his picture. You saw his picture in a couple beats of the apartment. And then later you see the big pictures when they're in the factory. And then there's the times where he fell out of favor. So I take the picture down. And so that was something that was really subtle that I had charted just to make sure there was historical accuracy and it's very subtle and subtext. But the other thing also is because our show had a very specific idea of how we were shooting for those vignettes, there was an idea of creating almost composed looks, very kind of Wes Anderson in a sense. So we were looking at that kind of compositions. We also wanted to have a color through line. And of course, Heidi and I'd love of green. And obviously in a lot of Chinese architecture decor, you would see green. So we had the green and the red, which became a through line through a lot of the Chinese sets. And you've seen the similar color palette in the factory. And then Celia Chung's office as she's moving up in the world. And then even in a reference to another episode 7, which was more of a dream sequence, we go to a Chinese restaurant. We also have the same color palette there.
The factory was impressive, actually, just with all those vintage sewing machines. Even the color felt right.
It was, and that was a location, not the sewing machines, but the actual building is a 1940s laundry, which sadly is now vacated. I hate to say it will probably be condo soon. But anyways, the color was there and it just really fed into our world and the textures of the building. And then we had to bring in and source all these vintage sewing machines. And again, that was something we had to be really specific of what kind of sewing machines they would have. And that was a bit of a project on our set deck department to find all these perfect sewing machines.
Well, even when I saw that clothing actually moving, I was like, oh, shoot, did they bring that in? But it sounds like it was part of the location.
That was a fortuitous thing when we saw that. We're like, oh my God, we have to use this. Like the idea that these old fashioned conveyor belts where all the uniforms could just.
It gives such a good movement and draws the eye. I love that. I know it's just a small piece, but I love that you did the BBC show.
I mean, I went back and I started researching BBC shows and talk shows from the 80s and the 70s. And I just sort of take the design aesthetic from that period. It was really quite fun. I felt we really captured it with the color palette of this pink and mint green colors. Yeah, we had fun with that one for sure.
You mentioned the shooting on location. I'm imagining all your family, all of that was on location, including the room with the dollhouse.
There's a big story of the Collier House because that was one of the things that we ended up reshooting from the pilot. We had to have a standing set available to us. So we looked for houses for quite a long time and nothing was really clicking. So what ended up happening is that the house itself is a combination of 3 different elements. So we have an exterior house, which we use only the ground floor. They wanted a French Norman style house, which is not a popular style in Vancouver. So I basically designed the house from the ground floor that would be the second floor up. So everything that was not on the ground level was CGI. And then the interior was actually a completely different house. One of the things that made the whole situation very pressed for time is that we only had 4 weeks to build the dollhouse, and which everyone thinks, well, it's a dollhouse, it's small, but I mean, it was a 16-room dollhouse, fully furnished, and had to be a perfect match to our location. So I had to basically take the pieces of the location on the exterior that we were using, and then I drew what we were going to do on the top because we hadn't even got to the point of CGI at that point. And then we had to design and draw that set, the model of what the top was. We did a computer model, whereas then we went and sent LiDAR scanning teams to the actual location. So we LiDAR scanned the ground level of the location house, and then we LiDAR scanned all the rooms that we're using in the interior house. And then I had to figure out how to package them together because they were totally different buildings. And then we had to draw up for part of the house and then make that in computer model that our props department and Keith Mullen, who's a wonderful props master who did this, nearly killed them all. But anyways, they built this dollhouse, and then we ended up wanting to make sure all the interior decoration of the dollhouse matched the real house. So we scanned all the wallpapers, we scanned every stick of furniture, and then they meticulously reduced everything and painted to match the real furniture. And then we dressed the set on a weekend, and then we brought in the dollhouse on the Monday, and we had to go in and basically arrange all the furniture to match where all the furniture ended up being in the set.
Tell me a little bit about your process of designing the bowels of the ship, because that's not something we often get to see.
We did a lot of research on the bowels of the ship. We had a lot of photographs from the Queen Mary, and they have a lot of documentation of what the inner workings and the bowels and the ship look like. One of the things that was fortuitous is just prior to starting the project, I was doing a pilot, and I went to a brewery in downtown Vancouver, Molson's Brewery, and it was decommissioned. And I had started to do research for Death and Other Details, and I was like, oh, this looks really similar to some of the images I've been looking at. So I put that in my thought bank. And when we came to the part where we had to introduce that section of the ship, I said, we need to go back to this brewery and start taking a look at what we can do there. But then the other thing we also had is because we had sections of the ship that had to be very specific, and we knew we were going to run over multiple episodes. Why I ended up convincing everyone to go to that particular studio was that there is all sorts of mechanical rooms in the studio that I know have been used for different filming. And I thought, why don't we combine this location and these mechanical rooms on our stages? And then we started building into our mechanical room to make it more like the brewery, but also bringing elements of the research that we saw. So it was actually split over a location and a set that we actually adapted in our stages using our mechanical rooms. And we would build in elements into it, like the room where we find our Ukrainian refugees. We added more lighting. I changed the floor colors to bring it into more of a vintage world, which fortunately was also the floor color of the brewery. And then the other set, which was part of the bowels of the ship, was the wet dock where we had the motorboat that took them to land. And that was actually only a 2-wall set. And it was something that I thought we were getting a little pressed for resources. And I just said, okay, if we just took one wall that existed and built the other wall and then adapted it, and with a little bit of help with CGI water, suddenly we had a fairly convincing room that you imagine they would have this boat in that would take people to land. So that was how the bowels of the ship developed. And then the other part, and it was not really the bowels, but the crew quarters and that were something that we also did research on. And it was also a lot of talking about the sort of social stratification of the ship and how the aesthetics of those spaces would be perceived.
The area with the server towers, that's a stage build?
That was stage built. We used it quite a lot. It was the hallway that went to the crew cabin, the hallway that went to the security room that we would reuse it. And then what we did was we rebuilt a whole series of walls that would be able to be hacked open by Mandy Patinkin And we basically lined them all with servers, and that was part of the stage build. And a lot of things that we did in order to maximize the aesthetic and the scale of our show, we would do a lot of flipping of sets. So there are sets that are the same set, but we reworked them for each different type of aesthetic that we needed.
There are so many sets that makes total sense. I can only imagine how much building you already did. You said 3 stages? Is that what it
But
was?
we had 2 conventional size stages. And the other thing I should mention is this facility, this stage used to be a printing press. So they had warehouses. And then we had this very bizarre shaped stage, which used to be where all the printing presses were. It was 30 feet wide. It was 450 feet long, and it was 51 feet tall. And so we had that stage, which is where we put the dining room and the promenades. So that one was a bit of a brain tease to figure out how to maximize the use of that space. Then we had 2 other stages that were like literally chock-a-block full, and then we had to put the pool deck outside.
Let's talk about a little more about Sunil's office. You mentioned that you went darker in color. Was there anything else that you had pictured for him, or through your research, you found the sort of look for his
I
office?
mean, Sunil's office was one of the first sets that I designed when I took over the show. And I was really fresh off my research and quite inspired by things that I had seen, the aesthetics, and also just the architectural geometries of how Art Deco was built. And I really played with the sort of architectural aspect of that set, where a lot of the design elements I was looking at had circles and squares, and I played with the geometry of the floor plan a lot. People were referring to as the butterfly or the bow tie, where I had a central circular area that had the elliptical columns around it. And I made that a bit of a taller space where the desk was. And then there was the side spaces, which, because I worked everything on a radius, were almost these like wings into the set. And I really wanted to have his space to be one of the most luxurious spaces because, of course, he's the owner of the ship and the dream and vision of this beautiful world. So I really played with the architecture. The columns were all wood with inlaid brass tubes, and they weren't round columns. Then we would inlay artwork. There was a whole series of cubist murals that I don't know if they even made it to camera, but they were above in the circular rotunda of the center of the room. And it was all based on sailing themes. I even did a small Italian futurist sculpture that we saw on a pedestal. And then we brought in a lot of elements of the idea of the sea, elements of his real interest in this pre-1955 period. And again, the lush green was there. The tone of the wood, I think, made it really lush and beautiful. But obviously, it was inspired by my conversation with Mahni about the skin tones and things. But I just also think it just made everybody look beautiful in there. And that's the other thing that I always want to make sure is that our actors look beautiful in the spaces that they are inhabiting, especially shows like this where everybody needs to be beautiful.
It really does matter as to how they look against the color and the texture and the patterns, like whether it actually vibes with them. Yeah.
A lot of the colors and things I was able to also work with Mandy Line, who was our costume designer. And even though we're all frantically busy, we somehow had some sort of brain synergy going on that worked so well together.
The questions were actually quite beautiful.
Yeah. And one of the things I do feel the visual success of the show is that all the departments, like the cinematography, the production design, the costumes, everything kind of worked hand in glove with each other. And I have a big shout out to Mandy because I really respect her work. And I mean, she really killed it on the show.
Mentions the scale of the dining area, even the pool deck, and then certainly all the bedrooms, like Anna's space. It's huge.
That was the beginning concept. Just like we have to sell luxury on this one. And then part of it is you have to sell scale. And also the back and forth with scale and the details of luxury, like the velvets, the subtle pieces of dressing. And that was probably the primary mandate is luxury and scale.
The final 2 episodes, there's quite a turn, even in color. I'd say that it felt to me like there was a color shift. Could you talk me through the color scheme or like the ship thing?
So basically, for the majority of the series, we're on the ocean liner, which has this beautiful, lush, dark woods and the green velvets and blushes and all sorts of different colors. And so it's maybe a bit of spoiler, but there is a cataclysmic event. and the characters have to shift into a different world. Leaving the ship, they're going on to some more ordinary and everyday ferries and things like that. So it's not as rarefied and not as heightened. It becomes more of an ordinary world for that time period. And then there's a whole time jump of what happens next. And we shift into a completely different world that has a very different vibe. It is an environment with winter and it's lighter colored, it's snow. It goes into a much more modernist aesthetic with different types of woods or like lighter woods. And then I think also pushes the color palette. And it also pushes the idea of how do you take a show that has a very strong aesthetic and then take what's successful of that aesthetic and then kind of twist it and move it forward, but maintaining the winning elements of the sort of first idea.
I'm assuming that the vast majority of the cataclysmic event was CGI, or how much did you have to do on your end?
Some of the sort of interior stuff, the shifting of the ship and some of the things happening was real, but there was a fair amount of CGI. And the final vision of the ship was CGI, but we used real ferries and sent them out to sea to be on a real ferry. So all the shots of the people gathering after getting off the ship was all real on the sea.
You never had the portion that you built. You never had that on a gimbal or anything for any of that. It was all in camera.
There was a discussion about putting it on a gimbal, and we were talking about practical water and everything going on, but I think we decided to work it in camera. I did a pilot many years ago in South Africa, and we had a ship, and there was a discussion about gimbal or not. And one of the things that came out of that, our visual effects coordinator, who is now on Shogun, but he said that you can do a lot on camera, and that's what we did. And so when we came to this, I said, it doesn't always have to be on a gimbal to make it successful. There's a few tricks that you have to do of shifting of elements and furniture and whatnot that could be done by special effects and camera work, and it can be quite convincing. And I think in both cases, that pilot and obviously Death and Other Details, I think it worked out convincingly.
I understand you've been working with your set decorator for a while. You mentioned that you sort of have the same brain.
Her name is Alex Royak, and we have a very connected relationship. I mean, actually, she was over at my house just yesterday for lunch. We initially started working on the show The 100, which is ironically where we also met Heidi, and kind of realized and developed this aesthetic where we understood each other's brain in terms of what we liked and what we didn't like. And I think we realized our aesthetics align really well. And even on The 100, which was post-apocalyptic and a very grim show, we do have this love of sort of bougie European and sort of glamorous things. Even on that show, we brought a lot of that idea together. And then subsequently, we've done a number of pilots together. And you get to the point when you work with decorators that you almost don't even have to speak. I know she would always make jokes that she would always sit across from me in production meetings because I do not have a poker face, and she could tell my thoughts on certain topics and things just by the way my eyes would move around or some facial expression. So you get to the point where you really don't have to even talk that much, even though we do talk quite a lot. We just already instinctively know what each other is going to bring to the table. Even having said that, we often would have this deal with each other that sometimes when we were looking through things, that there would be certain pieces of furniture or an item that we would disagree on. And we always had this rule that if I liked something and she hated it, and she liked something I hated, we'd always put it on the set. We'd have one item that we would allow on the set that the other hated. And then, of course, being the production designer, I always said, well, I had the ultimate veto. If I still hated it when I was on the set, I would take it off. But I never really did. We had that kind of strong relationship, and I really enjoy working with Alex.
So for you, what was the most challenging set on the show?
I think the challenging parts of the show, we kind of touched upon the dollhouse, but the pool deck was also a very challenging piece because it was a very big set and there was a lot of logistics in the set in terms of where we'd go, what it would be, structuralizing something outside. We had water involved, and then obviously a whole bunch of CGI. And it was also a lot of thinking about how it fit into the context of the CGI ship, developing the idea that there was multiple levels of decks that we didn't really have in a real world, but it would only be in a virtual world, but also understanding how the set itself fit together. So I would say that probably was the most challenging set, was the pool deck. But I think when I see it, particularly, I think it's in episode 8, and there's a pullback, and we see Anna after she's done, and you see that set, and then you see the decks below, which are all CGI. It just seems so perfect, and everything fit into its place in such a natural way. So that made me proud when I saw that shot. I was like, okay, I love this shot.
Was that your favorite?
I don't think it was my favorite set, but it was definitely a set that I was really very proud of in the end. It was very challenging. I think my favorite sets are the dining room and Sunil's office. Those are, I would say, personal favorites.
For clarification, because I'm looking at the photo, can you tell me just about that, about what of the deck was built?
The pool deck has a hot tub in it, has the bar, and it has a sort of a surround, and there's staircase to what would be the pool. That part was CGI. So it was only the hot tub level that was built. But when I referenced decks, there was a promenade deck that we built as well. And that was built inside the stage in that very strangely shaped stage I was referring to. And that was a promenade, which was a double heighted space that we had. So we had a lower, wider promenade that would walk along the railings to the ocean. And then we had a staircase up to a thinner walkway. And then we had what I call the sort of inner promenade, where we had an enclosed space that was very reminiscent of all the ships from the time period. And then on top of that, physically, we had another deck where we dressed in a cafe, and we had shuffleboards and different elements in there. And that was all built. And that set was probably 200 feet long, and it was built in the stage, and it was double height. And what we ended up having to do is, because the stage was so narrow, we ended up having to cut holes in the walls of the stage so that we could have doors onto the promenade. So we actually literally cut holes in the walls of the stage, which unfortunately the landlords let us do. And it really, really made it more convincing.
Thanks so much for being here, and hopefully we'll see you again in Vancouver at another event.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.